The mist came in off the Indian Ocean at dawn on July 19th, 1972, soft and grey, smelling of salt and goat dung. In a small fort overlooking the fishing village of Mirbat, on the southern coast of Oman, a 23-year-old captain from the Special Air Service named Mike Keeley was finishing a mug of tea. He had 8 men with him. Around the perimeter, a handful of local gendarmerie and a few dozen lightly armed askars from the Sultan's irregular tribal levies were stirring. The monsoon, the Kharif, had clamped its damp lid down on the Dhofar plateau and grounded the strike masters of the Sultan's air force at Salalah. Keeley expected another quiet morning. The signals intelligence had picked up nothing. At 05:30, the first mortar round dropped out of the cloud and burst inside the wire. Within minutes, the men in the British Army training team house realised they were not facing the usual 10 or 15 Adu probing the perimeter. There were 250 of them, possibly more, coming down out of the Jebel in a coordinated assault. Trained communist guerrillas of the Popular Front for the liberation of the occupied Arabian Gulf, equipped by Moscow and Peking, dispatched from camps in Marxist South Yemen. They were carrying Kalashnikovs, RPG-7s, and Shpagin heavy machine guns. They had picked the day deliberately. They knew the cloud would keep the aircraft on the ground at Salalah. They knew the SAS detachment was about to rotate out, that the men in the fort were tired. They intended to overrun Mirbat, butcher the garrison, parade the dead through Dhofar, and crack the Sultan's regime open like an egg. What followed over the next 4 hours was, by any reckoning, one of the most extraordinary small unit actions in British military history. And the British public would not learn a word of it for years. There would be no statement in the Commons, no briefing at the Ministry of Defence, no mention in the dispatches read out on the BBC. The men who held Mirbat that morning were officially not there. The war they were fighting was officially not happening. This is the story of how a few hundred British soldiers, working in the shadows of an empire Britain had supposedly already given up, fought and won a secret colonial war in the Arabian desert at the height of the Cold War. It is the story of a palace coup in Muscat that Whitehall arranged and then denied arranging. It is the story of hawker hunters strafing Marxist guerrillas in a country the Foreign Office insisted contained no British combat troops. It is the story of a Fijian sergeant called Laba Laba, who served a Second World War 25-pounder gun on his own, with a bullet in his jaw because there was nobody else to do it. And it is the story of why, when almost every other British counter-insurgency campaign of the late 20th century ended in awkward retreat or sour stalemate, this one was an outright, comprehensive, almost embarrassingly successful victory. A victory so quiet that 50 years on, most Britons have still never heard of it. How did a handful of men from Hereford end up holding a fort on the edge of the empty quarter against Chinese-trained communists? Why did successive governments, Conservative and Labour alike, mislead Parliament about the deployment? And what happened in those 4 hours at Mirbat that broke the back of the rebellion? To understand any of that, we have to go back. Back to a Britain that thought it had finished with Arabia for good. In January 1968, a tired Labour Chancellor named Roy Jenkins stood up in the House of Commons and announced what amounted to the formal end of the British Empire east of Suez. The pound had collapsed 2 months earlier. Harold Wilson's government, mauled by devaluation and squeezed by the Treasury, had decided it could no longer afford to police the Persian Gulf, Singapore, and Malaysia simultaneously. By 1971, all British forces would withdraw from the Trucial States, from Bahrain, from Aden's old hinterland. 3 centuries of Pax Britannica in the Indian Ocean would be wound up by accountants. In Washington, Robert McNamara was reported to have wept. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew sent furious cables. In Whitehall, the chiefs of staff drafted memoranda warning that the Soviet Union and its proxies would pour into the vacuum. Dennis Healey, the defense secretary, defended the decision with characteristic asperity, but he knew what was being given up. The empire on which the sun had famously refused to set was now setting, deliberately, by cabinet vote, on a Tuesday afternoon. There was one exception. One stubborn, anomalous corner of the old imperial system that nobody at the Foreign Office quite wanted to abandon. The Sultanate of Muscat and Oman occupied the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, commanding the entire southern coast of the Strait of Hormuz. Through that narrow waterway passed something approaching 90% of the oil consumed by Western Europe and Japan. If the strait closed, the West froze. If a hostile, Soviet-aligned regime ever planted itself on the Omani side of the strait, the strategic consequences for Britain and for NATO were close to catastrophic. Oman was not, strictly speaking, a British colony. It had never been formally annexed, but it had been bound to Britain by treaty since the 18th century. Its armed forces were officered by British officers on secondment. Its sultan kept his money in coots, and its independence was, in the polite phrase used at King Charles Street, underwritten by Her Majesty's government. The sultan in question, in 1970, was Said bin Taimur. He had ruled since 1932. He was 60 years old, deeply pious, fluent in English and Urdu, and almost wholly disconnected from the 20th century. He lived in a crumbling palace in Salalah on the southern coast, surrounded by slaves and concubines. He had banned spectacles, radios, music, football, trousers, smoking in public, and the construction of new houses. There were no secondary schools in the country. There were 3 small hospitals. The capital, Muscat, was a medieval walled town whose gates were still locked at sundown by a man with an iron key. Anyone abroad after dark was required to carry a hurricane lamp. There were in the whole country perhaps 6 miles of paved road. Inevitably, the country was a tinderbox. Out in the western province of Dhofar, a green, monsoon-fed plateau that looked more like Kenya than Arabia, discontent had hardened in the early 1960s into open insurrection. By the late 1960s, the original tribal rebels of the Dhofar Liberation Front had been pushed aside by a far more dangerous successor, the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, or PFLOAG. The PFLOAG were Marxist-Leninists. They had been trained in Aden, in Iraq, and at Nanking. Their political officers carried little red books. Their commissars preached the abolition of Islam and the liberation of the Gulf from British imperialism and Arab feudalism. By the spring of 1970, they controlled most of the Dhofari interior. The Sultan's forces held only the coastal strip. The whole rotten edifice was weeks, perhaps days, from collapse, and with it, the strait, and with the strait, the West's oil. Whitehall had a problem. The problem, as the Joint Intelligence Committee saw it in the spring of 1970, was that the Sultanate could not be saved as long as Said bin Taimur sat on its throne. The old man refused to spend the oil revenues that had begun trickling in from the first Omani fields. He refused to build roads, schools, or clinics. He refused even to meet his own son, a quiet young officer named Qaboos, who had been sent to Sandhurst in 1960, commissioned into the Cameronians, and then, on his return to Oman, placed under effective house arrest in his father's palace. Qaboos was 29 years old, fluent in English, fascinated by classical music, and quietly furious. He had spent his 20s watching his country rot. In London, the Foreign Office had been turning a particular question over for months. Sir William Luce, who had served as the last political resident in the Gulf, put it most bluntly in a memorandum that crossed the desk of the Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas Home, that summer. The Sultanate, Luce wrote, had to be modernized, and the Sultan would never modernize it. The conclusion was implicit, but obvious. The father had to go. The son had to replace him. The mechanism by which this was arranged has never been fully declassified, and probably never will be. What is known is this. In June 1970, Edward Heath's newly elected Conservative government inherited the file. The Defence Secretary, Lord Carrington, and the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Home, agreed that something had to be done. Colonel Hugh Oldman, a former British officer who served as the Sultan's Defence Secretary, was the man on the ground. He worked closely with the British Consul General in Muscat, David Crawford, and with elements of the Sultan's armed forces still loyal enough, or pragmatic enough, to back the right horse. On July 23, 1970, Qaboos's men, led by the Wali of Dhafar's son, and a small group of officers from the Sultan's armed forces walked into the Sultan's palace in Salalah. There was a brief, untidy gunfight. Said bin Taimur shot himself in the foot with his own pistol, then surrendered. He was flown to RAF Bahrain on a British aircraft, and from there to a suite at the Dorchester Hotel on Park Lane, where he lived out his remaining 2 years in air-conditioned exile, watching cricket on television. His son was now Sultan. And the first thing Sultan Qaboos bin Said did, almost before the dust had settled in the palace courtyard, was to ask London for help. What he received was not a brigade. It was not a battalion. It was, at first, a few dozen men. The 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, based at Bradbury Lines in Hereford, had been quietly preparing for an Omani deployment for some months. Its commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Watts, a Northumbrian with a military cross from Malaya and a face like a weathered axe head. Watts had thought hard about counter-insurgency. He had read Templar on Malaya, Kitson on Kenya, and the French on Algeria. He understood that the only way to defeat a guerrilla movement was to separate it from the population that fed and sheltered it. You could not do that with air power. You could not do that with battalions of conscripts. You had to do it with small teams, living among the people, building local forces, winning what the Americans, in a parallel war on the other side of the world, were calling hearts and minds. The deployment was given a code name, Operation Storm. Officially, of course, it was not happening at all. The cover story was elegant in its banality. The men sent to Oman were not, the Ministry of Defence maintained, the Special Air Service. They were the British Army Training Team, BAT, in the inevitable acronym, a small advisory mission sent at the request of a friendly head of state to assist in the modernisation of his armed forces. There was no combat role. There were no British casualties because, manifestly, there were no British combatants. When the question was raised in the House of Commons, ministers from both Heath's Conservative government and, after February 1974, Harold Wilson's returning Labour administration gave variations of the same emollient non-answer. A small training mission, they conceded. Numbers were a matter for the Sultan. Operational details could not be discussed. The truth, on the ground in Dhofar, was rather different. The first SAS squadron arrived in the autumn of 1970. They flew into Salalah on RAF Britannias in civilian clothes with their weapons in sealed crates labelled as agricultural equipment. They linked up with Watts's reconnaissance team and got to work. The five-pronged campaign Watts had designed was deceptively simple. First, gather intelligence on the Adu, the enemy in Arabic, and on the population that sheltered them. Second, provide medical aid to the Dhofari tribes, who had received almost none under the old Sultan. Third, supply veterinary care to the cattle and goats on which the Jeapes tribes depended for their survival. Fourth, provide information, radios, leaflets, schools, to break the communists' monopoly on news. Fifth, and crucially, raise irregular tribal militias from among defectors and dissatisfied PFLOAG fighters. These units would be called firkats. They would be commanded by their own sheikhs and led, day to day, by SASNCOs. They would fight their own kinsmen for control of the Jebel. It was the fifth element that changed everything. The first Firkat Salahaddin, was raised in the autumn of 1970 from PFLOAG, defectors who had grown disillusioned with the movement's brutality, its hostility to Islam, and its execution of religious traditionalists. By 1971, there were a dozen Firkats. By 1973, more than 20. The SAS men who lived with them slept in their tents, ate their food, learned their dialects, and when the moment came, fought beside them up the wadis of the Kara Mountains. It was Templar's Malayan template carried into the Arabian Peninsula, refined and accelerated. But the Adu were not finished. Backed by Marxist South Yemen, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the only Arab Marxist-Leninist state ever to exist, they could replenish their forces from training camps at Hof, just over the border. By the summer of 1972, PFLOAG's leadership had concluded that the British advisors represented an existential threat to the rebellion. They had to be hit, and hit hard, in a way that would expose the lie of the training mission and shake confidence in Qaboos. They needed a target, a garrison small enough to overrun, a position remote enough to be cut off, a symbolic value high enough to be worth the casualties. And they needed weather, specifically the deep Kharif cloud that would ground the Sultan's strikemaster jets at Salalah and leave any British detachment without close air support. Through the spring and early summer of 1972, the PFLOAG's military council picked their target. They chose a coastal fishing town 200 miles southeast of Salalah, perched on a thin shelf of land between the Jebel and the Indian Ocean. It had a small fort, a handful of gendarmes, a few dozen askars, and at any given time, a 9-man bat team. The town was called Mirbat. The date set for the assault was July 19th. The Kharif arrived on schedule. Captain Mike Keeley had been in Oman 6 weeks. He had taken over command of B Squadron's 9-man detachment at Mirbat only days before. He was 23. His men, by contrast, were veterans. 2 of them, Sergeant Talayasi Labalaba and Trooper Sekunaya Takavesi, were Fijians, recruited into the British Army in the 1960s, both built like rugby second rows, both with several years in the regiment. The medic, Trooper Tommy Tobin, was a young lad from Cheshire. The signaller, Lance Corporal Harris, kept the high frequency set in the bat house warm 24 hours a day. 2 GPM-G gunners, Pete Warne and Roger Cole, manned the sandbag positions on the roof. At 0530, the first 81mm mortar bomb burst inside the gendarmerie fort perimeter. Within 90 seconds, Laba Laba was sprinting across 800 yards of open ground, under fire, to reach the Second World War vintage 25-pounder gun in the Sangar outside the wire. The gun, a relic of the 8th Army, was the only piece of artillery at Mirbat. It was meant to be served by a crew of 6. Laba Laba reached it alone. He began firing the gun at near point-blank range, dropping the barrel almost horizontal, loading and aiming and firing by himself, switching from high explosive to direct fire as the Aidoo closed to within 100 yards. A bullet hit him in the jaw. He kept firing. Takavesi sprinted out to join him, was shot twice, dragged himself behind the sandbags, propped himself up, and began firing his SLR one-handed. An Omani gunner named Walid joined them and was shot in the stomach. Laba Laba reached for a fresh round, was hit again in the neck, and died at the gun. From the BATT house roof, Keeley watched the Furkat positions on the outer wire being overrun. He could see the Aidoo moving through the perimeter with Bangalore torpedoes. The cloud was solid grey above his head. The strike masters at Salalah were grounded. He had perhaps minutes. He took Trooper Tobin and made for the gun pit on foot, 800 yards through small arms fire and falling mortar bombs. They reached the Sangar to find Laba Laba dead, Takavesi propped against the wall, pouring tracer at point-blank range into the Aidoo coming over the wire, and Walid bleeding out. Tobin began treating the wounded. A round struck him in the face. He died of his wounds a fortnight later. And then, at 09:30, the cloud thinned for a few crucial minutes. 2 Strike Master jets of the Sultan's Air Force, flown by seconded RAF pilots Flight Lieutenant David Milne-Smith and Flight Lieutenant Sean Creek, came in beneath the ceiling at 0 feet, popped up over Mirbat, and began strafing the Aidoo positions with cannon and 540-pound bombs. One strike master was hit and limped back to Salalah. The other kept attacking. At the same moment, 23 men of G Squadron, who had landed at Salalah that morning to take over from B Squadron, were piled onto helicopters and flown to a beach south of Mirbat. They debussed behind the Aidoo and opened fire with GPMGs and a 60mm mortar. By midday, it was over. The Popular Front for the liberation of the occupied Arabian Gulf had lost between 50 and 100 dead on the wire, and many more wounded carried back into the Jebel. 2 SAS men, Laba Laba and Tobin, were dead. Takavesi, Walid, and several Omani gendarmes were grievously wounded. Keeley walked back to the BATT house through the smoke, unhurt. The communist assault on Mirbat had failed. The myth of PFL, OAG, invincibility on the Jebel, had broken. And in London, the Ministry of Defence said nothing at all. The bodies of Talayasi Laba Laba and Tommy Tobin were flown home in unmarked coffins, draped in regimental flags, only once they were behind closed doors at RAF Lynham. Laba Laba, the Fijian who had served the 25-pounder alone with a bullet in his jaw, was buried at St. Martin's Church, Hereford, in the regimental plot. Tobin was buried in his home parish. There was no public funeral. There were no honours read out in Parliament. There was no front-page coverage in the Times, the Telegraph, or the Guardian. The Defence Secretary, Lord Carrington, was not asked about the battle in the House of Lords because nobody in the House of Lords had been told that the battle had happened. This was the bargain Whitehall had made with itself. The campaign in Dhofar was officially deniable, and so its casualties had to be denied too. Over the 6 years of Operation Storm, 24 British servicemen died on attachment to the Sultan's armed forces, of whom 12 were SAS. Several more were grievously wounded. Their families received pensions channeled through arrangements that did not appear in any published budget. The press, by and large, played along. The D-Notice Committee, the formal mechanism by which the British media accepted state guidance on what not to report in the national interest, kept Operation Storm out of the newspapers throughout the campaign. The first detailed accounts of Mirbat did not appear in the British press until 1980, and a full, sourced military history did not exist until Major General Tony Jeapes published SAS Operation Oman that same year. There were costs beyond the bodies. The political risk taken by Heath's government in 1970 and inherited by Wilson's in 1974 was considerable. If the deployment had been exposed at the wrong moment, during a parliamentary debate on east of Suez, for example, or in the middle of the February 1974 election campaign, the cabinet would have faced a constitutional row of the first order. Successive governments had given the Commons answers about Oman that were, at best, evasive. Tam Dalyell, the famously persistent Labour MP for West Lothian, asked questions about the deployment more than once and received non-answers each time. Hansard records the encounters with a certain awkward terseness. There were intelligence costs too. The Soviet Union and its proxies in South Yemen were not fooled. The KGB residencies in Aden and Baghdad knew precisely who the men in the BATT houses were. The deception was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the British public, at the United Nations, and at the Arab states of the Gulf, for whom Sultan Qaboos's legitimacy depended on the pretense that he was defending his country with his own forces, not with British soldiers in Shemus. The biggest cost, though, was carried by the men themselves and by their families. They could not tell their wives where they were. They could not tell their children what they had done. When Sekonaya Takavesi, the Fijian trooper who had crawled to the gun pit at Mirbat, recovered from his wounds and returned to Hereford, he could not even tell soldiers in other regiments where he had been. He had no medal to wear. The military medal eventually awarded to him for Mirbat was gazetted, but in oblique terms. Laba Laba received only a mention in dispatches posthumously. It would take more than 30 years and a sustained campaign by veterans for his action at the gun to be properly recognized. He has still not received the Victoria Cross many believe he earned. Britain had won at Mirbat, but it had won in silence. Mirbat was the turning point of the war, though nobody in London or Salalah said so at the time. The Popular Front's leadership had staked enormous prestige on the assault. They had committed their best trained battalion. They had counted on weather, surprise, and numbers, and they had been broken on a fishing village's outer wire by 9 British soldiers and a Fijian sergeant with a 25-pounder. Defections from the PFLOAG to the Furkarts, already gathering pace, now accelerated sharply. Recruits to the rebellion in the camps at Half began to dry up. Sultan Qaboos's reformed armed forces, increasingly competent under their British officered command, began to push back into the Jebel in earnest. By 1973, the Iranian Shah, watching events nervously from across the Strait of Hormuz, agreed to commit an Imperial Iranian Brigade group to Dhofar. King Hussein of Jordan sent engineers. The Sultan's armed forces, by now numbering close to 15,000, were equipped with British Saladin armoured cars, Saracen personnel carriers, and a growing fleet of strike masters and hawker hunters. The SAS rotated squadrons through Dhofar continuously, with each 3-month tour passing on hard-earned lessons to the next. Brigadier John Ulkerhurst, who took command of Dhofar Brigade in 1974, oversaw the construction of 2 great defensive lines, the Hornbeam Line and the Damavand Line, strung with wire and watched by Sangars, which methodically cut the rebellion off from its South Yemeni rear. By the summer of 1975, the PFLOAG had been driven back into the mountains around the South Yemeni border. By December, Sultan Qaboos was able to declare the war won. On December 11, 1975, he announced victory. The last serious Adu positions inside Oman were cleared in early 1976. The Dhofar War was over. The only serious attempt to plant a Marxist-Leninist regime on the Arabian Peninsula had been defeated. Britain had achieved something extraordinary. With fewer than 500 men in country at the peak of the campaign, at a cost of 24 dead and a small line in the defence estimates, it had preserved the southern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, secured the West's oil supply, and demonstrated a counter-insurgency model that worked. The lessons of Malaya, refined in Kenya and Borneo, had been honed in Dhofar into something close to a doctrine. Small footprint, local forces, hearts and minds, patient, intelligence-led pressure. No grand sweeps, no battalions of conscripts, no body counts. The consequences for Britain were quiet, but profound. The Special Air Service, which had been a marginal, half-trusted outfit in the eyes of the wider army in 1969, emerged from Operation Storm as the most respected counter-insurgency force in the world. When the Iranian embassy in Prince's Gate was seized in May 1980, it was the Mirbat generation of officers and NCOs, men who had spent their 20s in Dhofar, who planned and executed the assault that fixed the SAS in the public imagination. Without Mirbat, there would have been no Prince's Gate. For Oman itself, the consequences were transformational. Sultan Qaboos, the quiet Sandhurst-trained heir installed by a Whitehall-backed coup, would rule for 50 years. He used the oil revenues his father had hoarded to build roads, schools, hospitals, and universities. He kept Oman scrupulously neutral in the Gulf's quarrels and on close, careful terms with both Whitehall and Washington. When he died in January 2020, the Foreign Secretary flew to Muscat for the funeral, and the Royal Marines provided a guard of honour at his memorial in London. And the special relationship Britain had with Oman, a relationship forged in a deniable war, survives intact to this day. There is a stone today, just outside the walls of the old gendarmerie fort at Mirbat, that marks the place where Talayasi Labalaba fell beside his gun. Every summer, on July 19th, a small ceremony is held there. Veterans of the regiment travel out from Hereford. Omani officers attend in dress uniform. The Sultan's armed forces send a guard. The names of Labalaba and Tobin are read aloud. There are no journalists. There are no cameras. It is, in the regimental phrase, a family affair. That quietness is, in a way, the whole point. The Dhofar War was the last campaign of the British Empire, fought and won after the empire was officially over. It was conducted on a budget so small it would barely have fitted in the margin of a single Vietnam-era American operation. It produced no parades, no medals worn openly, no published dispatches, no Sunday color supplements. It did, however, produce a strategic outcome of considerable consequence. The Strait of Hormuz did not fall to a Soviet-aligned regime. The Gulf oil that fueled the British, German, French, and Japanese economies through the 1970s and 1980s kept flowing. Sultan Qaboos's reformed, modernizing Oman became, and remains, one of the most stable states in the Arab world. It also produced a way of war. The Dhofar model, small teams of professionals embedded with local forces, focused on building indigenous capability rather than substituting for it, quietly became the template the British Army carried into Northern Ireland in the 1970s, into Sierra Leone in 2000, and, with rather more difficulty, into Helmand in the 2000s. When the Americans went looking, in the bloody aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, for examples of counterinsurgency campaigns that had actually worked, the books on the reading lists at Fort Leavenworth included Tony Jeapes's account of Operation Oman, alongside the Malayan classics. What does this story tell us about Britain in the late 20th century? Perhaps this. Long after the formal empire was wound up, long after Suez had supposedly proved that Britain could no longer act on the world stage without American permission, a small group of men working out of an unmarked compound in Hereford were quietly doing exactly that. They were defending British strategic interests in a region the country had supposedly left. They were running a deniable war on the deniable orders of two governments of opposite political colours. They were doing it well, and they were doing it cheaply, and they were doing it without a word of acknowledgement at home. There is something faintly melancholy in the silence. The men who fought at Mirbat went home, hung up their kit, and never spoke about it. Many of them are dead now. Their war is filed in the National Archives at Kew under cautious reference numbers, much of it still redacted. The full story of Operation Storm, the cables between Hugh Oldman and the Foreign Office, the role of MI6 in the coup, the precise nature of Heath's authorization, will not be known in any of our lifetimes, but Mirbat happened. The fort still stands. The stone is still there. Laba Laba's name is still read out every July. And the Strait of Hormuz is still open. If you found this story as extraordinary as I did when I first came across it, I would be grateful if you'd hit the like button. It really does help the channel reach more history enthusiasts. Do subscribe if you'd like more deep dives into the hidden corners of British military history. And in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you think. Should Sergeant Laba Laba have received the Victoria Cross? Was the Heath government right to keep the Dhofar War secret? Tell me your view. I read every comment. Until next time. Until